Welcome to The Law Matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. This program, as we tell you, has been created to educate, inform, and help you with law matters because the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better position to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. We continue to provide information and resources that'll help you to determine whether or not you might want to handle some issues yourself. If you do decide that you need outside professional counsel, you'll be better prepared, and so will the professional who you select. Our goal, of course, is to help you to save time, money, and achieve the best possible results. So we want to, of course, welcome and thank Attorney David Bazar from the Bazar & Associates law firm in East Providence. He continues to help us with the information and valuable insights on the various issues that we tackle. So today the topic, new year. New laws, a flurry, maybe even a blizzard of new laws and ordinances across the country, from crackdowns on plastic straws and foam cups to guns, and of course some measures that have been spurred by last year's shooting rampages. Of course, things about the Me Too scandal. Interesting, of course, 19 states and 21 cities have increased the minimum wage. We'll talk a little bit about that. And California was among the busiest with over 1,000 laws that are new on the books. So we'll tackle some of those. Of course, the typical topics, things about money, sex, gender-related issues, smoking, drugs. There's plenty to tackle. So let's go for the first one. Rhode Island and Massachusetts minimum wage increases. Thoughts about that? $10 to $10.50.
Yeah, and that's
in Rhode Island.
Rhode Island. And Massachusetts has a law, I guess, in place where it will go up this year and every year until it gets to, I think, $15 an hour or thereabouts in 2023 or something like that. So, yeah, I think those laws are, it's interesting. It's always the first of the year when many of these new laws take effect. And as you mentioned in the open, last year plastic straws were a big thing around the country. And I think this year it's going to be those little plastic bags. More
of those, too. Right. So when people are talking about money and minimum wage being increased, there's the employee and then there's the non-tip or the tipped wage. So those who are making, I guess in Massachusetts here, it's up to $20 a month. You can be paid only $3.75 an hour, which seems very low, to say the least.
Right. So on tipped employees, that tip is considered part of their wages. So they calculated it in to determine what would get them to at least minimum wage. And as an employee, you can certainly take a look at what you're making and decide whether or not you're better off working somewhere else, or if the tips create enough of an income flow with what you're getting for an hourly wage. And I think the hourly wage is designed so that there's a paycheck that's going out so that taxes can be deducted, and the employer is supposed to calculate out what the wages that are includable as tips would be, so that those are deducted from your taxes for tax purposes as well.
Makes sense. I know our own governor had said that people are so hardworking, they should be raised above the poverty line. On the other side of it, thinking about what employers are going to do, some of them don't really want to pay, never mind $10.50, they don't want to pay the $15 that it's nudging up to. Do you see or think that we're likely to find then more employers trying to, yes, of course, watch their bottom line and their cash flow, but also be less willing to employ full-time employees because then they have to absorb that new cost?
Sure. So it's more of an economic question than a legal question.
Yes.
But I certainly would think that it's a fine line between raising wages and how that might impact an employer's potential hiring of employees. And therefore, I think it's really all going to be based on how the economy's doing. So if the economy is doing well, employers need employees to do their business, they're going to hire, whether it's $10 an hour or $12 an hour or whatever it might be. On the other hand, if the economy is not doing well, it might impact that. And then as you started with, it's balancing, am I better off working at minimum wage or not? And so the minimum wage has to be high enough to incent people to get out and work. So it's a lot of weighing and balancing on an economic and political level as opposed to a legal level.
Sure. So from a legal standpoint, as I had read, 19 states and 21 cities, is there an opportunity for cities across the country to oppose what the state has set for a minimum wage? How does that work, David?
Do you mean to make a higher minimum wage?
Higher
because I don't think you can make a lower minimum wage. Yeah.
But cities can independently, individually opt to set it higher?
It would be an interesting question. So now that is a legal question.
Yes.
And on the legal side of it, if a state sets a minimum wage at a certain level and a city in that state says, that's not enough, we want it to be higher, it would be a really interesting question, because unlike state law and federal law, where you might have a preemption issue, where if the state tries to create a law that's in conflict with federal law, there might be an issue. I don't know that that preemption issue would apply from a city ordinance to a state law.
So do you see that that may be court-worthy at some point?
Well, I mean, it could be. I'm not sure that who's going to challenge it. An employer is to say that
Yes.
you, as a city, don't have a right to tell me what my minimum wage is if the state had already set it at a certain level. It's potentially a possible issue.
Could be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So of the other things, guns. It's an issue across the country. Certainly Parkland and other rampages have prompted people to respond in individual states in different ways. Interesting, for some reason California, our friends in California seem to have some of the most interesting laws. How about Guns N' Roses? Well, now they're saying that those who are convicted of some domestic violence offense are going to be losing their right to carry. I understand that, for life.
Right.
And misdemeanors too. In Rhode Island, in Massachusetts, do you see that wave? How do you feel about that?
Well, there has been talk about that, and it's always a potential argument. Certainly right now in Rhode Island, and I believe Massachusetts as well, but Rhode Island for sure, if you have a domestic restraining order filed against you, they take any firearms that are in the house or that you have.
So now they're saying that they will might permanently disqualify you from ever having a gun if you touched a spouse, if you had a roommate or a dating partner. So that seems like it's really lowering the bar. I understand why, because there have been so many issues raised, but is this going to be rampant, do you think, this year?
If there's a conviction of domestic assault, there certainly is a correlation to not being allowed to want to take the guns away from somebody who's been convicted. So I certainly can see that as an argument that might be made. And you know, the gun advocates will tell you
Yes.
that it's not the guns that are the problem, it's the people. So I wouldn't think, there's always going to be pushback, but I wouldn't think there would be a strong argument if you have a reasonably based law that says this group of people traditionally, convicted felons, people convicted of domestic violence.
Misdemeanors, too.
Yeah, well, domestic violence can be a misdemeanor.
Okay.
So if you have people convicted in those areas, are more likely to have misuse guns, that if you're going to say, well, those are the people who can't have them, and we're saying it's people who are the problem, not the guns, then that might be an argument that the gun lobby wouldn't fight against, but I wouldn't count on that.
So in the same vein,
I think they fight everything.
I think they do too. In the same vein, thinking about the issue about mental health, those who've been challenged, those who've been in an institution, they're saying across the board that they're deemed to be a danger to themselves and to others, therefore that equals you're not entitled to carry.
Right.
Do you think that that's going to have traction nationally?
Well, it's the same argument. It's people who are can be the problem with guns, not the guns. So if you have legitimate scientific, I call it scientific, but statistical evidence that supports the argument, then that's the argument. And again, the gun lobby's position should be that we want to protect people's right to bear arms, the Second Amendment. Second Amendment?
Second Amendment.
But you have to do that in a way that says you're going to address a problem that we know exists. And the problem we know exists is that there is gun violence, and there are people who commit gun violence. So if you can statistically show this is the group where you're most likely to get that gun violence from, well, let's do something to protect people from that violence.
So do you see with these new laws that are on the books, do you see that there's much more activity involved with lawyers these days? Because policing these certainly is an issue, and then because you can't entirely and completely police them, it's going to cause something that's going to prompt a case of some sort.
Well, some laws will be controversial and could absolutely spark litigation. Others may end up in that bin that we look back at every now and then from laws that are still on the books from 30, 40, 100 years ago and say, why do we have these laws? And were they ever enforced? And what are they really there for? And sometimes, I think we've done in the past shows on laws that are still on the books that we can't believe are on the books.
Make no sense, apparently.
Right, exactly, especially from when they were first passed and to where they are now.
So, with the Me Too issues that have been raised recently, employers are going to have something new to consider. It makes sense that you should ban workplace harassment, sexual harassment. One state, and obviously it's California, not surprisingly, bars employers from staving off discrimination claims by offering bonuses or, here's the word, job offers to aggrieved employees. Is that an issue that throwing money at fixes? And doesn't that at some point encourage people to complain because there's a what's in it for them that, I don't know, how do you evaluate that, David?
I'm not 100% sure of the workings of that particular law, but if what it's saying is if somebody's got a legitimate complaint and the company's way of fixing it is to offer you a different job, outside of?
Okay.
Is that what that's saying?
Well, it's saying it's a job offer, so it could be a job in a different department or a different city.
But if I'm understanding the fact pattern that we would be basing it on, I already work there.
Yes, that's what it's. That's what I include.
So I work there, and someone is harassing me in my job, in a particular area, department where I have interaction with this person, and the law says they have to offer me a job, perhaps in a different area of that company.
That sounds fairly reasonable, does it not?
If that's what it is, I would agree with that.
But what about offering bonuses? Doesn't that incentivize someone who, I don't know, maybe heard an off-color joke, which isn't nice, which isn't appropriate, but nevertheless, sometimes it happens. Doesn't that incentivize people to have a little complaint because they either get more money or transfer that they want?
I'm not sure what that side of it's about. So if it's saying, if you're harassed, we're not going to do anything about the harassment, but we'll give you a bonus. I don't think that fixes the problem.
Certainly.
And I don't think it's an answer that would really help. But again, we're only understanding a little portion of the law without having the whole thing in context.
And of course, as we're touching on so many of these things, there's only so much that we can do, and I haven't had the occasion to do the drill down on this. But at first blush...
And you might not be able to do the drill down until it's actually put in place and see how it's enforced.
That's right. Yet every time we read some of these things, it certainly prompts, yes, but what if? And doesn't this cause some potential problems? Speaking of employees, it seems that health insurance is on everyone's mind. Employers sometimes cover medical insurance, but sometimes they do not. There'd been the mandate about being fined. So that's being changed in 2019. So is there a penalty for not having health insurance? Yes, there was. Now apparently there's not.
Right.
Sounds like a good thing.
Yeah. So the only changes that I know of to the Affordable Health Care Act are they took away the mandate with the penalties, and everything else, as I understand it, has pretty much been left in place. And that was probably the one aspect of the law that most people objected to. And I think that's somewhat why the law has gone from being fairly unpopular to very popular.
Yes. At the cost, at some point they were talking about $200 if you didn't have the insurance. Well, most people, especially young people, would say, I'd rather pay the $200 because there isn't a health premium around that would be that low, and I'd certainly rather pay that than the other amount. Yet they're saying the 2018 tax penalty for not having health insurance was $695. Certainly that's a little more. but nevertheless lower than if you were to pay premiums, and children $347.50, so, or 2% of your yearly income. It certainly, I understand that it was designed to protect people from skipping out on health
Right.
insurance, but
But that's been done away with.
done away with
correct?
now. That's as of 2019.
So it's still in effect for 18 if you didn't have insurance.
Yes.
But the penalty part of it's phased out
Is phased
for
out.
2019. And again, that's what many people objected to. I understand the purpose of it. It was sort of like an incentive to force people to get health insurance.
Yes.
And of course, some of the statistics, again, I guess, is you want to have those healthy people get health insurance too, to
Right.
offset the cost of the people who have it that aren't so healthy.
Right, to help underwrite
And
it.
that's one of the ideas of how you're going to drive down costs and everything. But that was the very unpopular part of the whole act.
It'll be interesting to see how things change. Apparently in Rhode Island, one of the things that's changed this year, and I just happened to notice this, that while mastectomies are always covered, I guess, with health insurance, there was a very onerous part, which was a costly deductible, and apparently now that's being absorbed or taken
Right.
care of. And for those who've had to pay for out-of-pocket expenses, equipment, and other things that go along with the mastectomy, at least now those two are being covered thanks to the state of Rhode Island.
Right.
Seems like a healthy thing.
I think anything you can do to improve what's covered is a good thing.
Sounds right. Smoking bans. It makes sense that you can't and shouldn't be smoking in schools, in your health facilities, outside your or at your doctor's office. But 21 is now the legal age in Massachusetts.
Right.
Is that true in Rhode Island too? I didn't check that out. Do you know if that's the case?
I thought it was. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that was my understanding. I don't think it's 18. It could be. But anything to restrict access to tobacco, I think, is a good thing, which is interesting because we're trying to unrestrict access to marijuana.
That was the other part of that question,
Right.
Sure. How does that happen? So you could be 16 and buy...
But now,
No, 18. 18 to buy cannabis.
I think so.
Even the
Yeah.
edibles?
Well, but it's, again, interesting. I'm not sure about that. And the legalization in Rhode Island hasn't passed. I'm not sure what
Right.
the rule is in Massachusetts. But if I'm a lawmaker in Rhode Island and I'm looking at these things, if 18 were the age that you could buy cigarettes, but I think it's 21, I would want it to be 21. And I think the same thing with marijuana. And if I'm a lawmaker in Rhode Island and sitting there, and I have clients that are in this field, so I have a conflict, if you will, but I don't think it's a conflict, it's just my client's interest, which I think is, why would you not want to legalize the marijuana in your state if you're surrounded by states that
Yes.
have legalized marijuana and your residents are going to cross those lines, bring back all of the same problems that you're worried about, and you're not getting any income from the revenue. And I really think that it's at a point where how are we doing in Massachusetts with it? I think they're doing pretty well.
Yes.
And so if you can get a portion of that income in Rhode Island, why wouldn't you want to have the income if you're going to be dealing with the problems anyway?
I think that's quite close to the very argument that Governor Raimondo posed very recently when she was interviewed, not favoring the legalization of it recreationally, but said, look at the situation as it is. And I think that that's what's driving what might become a law in Rhode Island as well.
I think she can look at it and understand whether or not she personally thinks it was the best answer, that if you're going to face all of those issues and you have a deficit, and it's a way of helping to clear the deficit, why wouldn't you do that? And I understand all of the issues. I understand that, well, what do we do with driving under the influence? And before you had breathalyzers and all of that, you had enforcement for driving under the influence of alcohol. It was based on observation, and officers are being trained in drug recognition. So they would call DREs, I think, drug recognition experts. So there are things you can do. And if you want to make a lot of money, figure out how to test somebody to see what the level of influence is from the marijuana so that it can be done similar to a breathalyzer.
I'm sure that you're right that they're probably moving in that direction.
Oh, I'm sure they are.
Leave it to California. Yet another new law on their books is that they are banning restaurants and stores from selling liquor, booze, that has been laced with cannabis. So they're trying to prevent you from being both inebriated and high at the same single shot. Apparently, and not surprisingly, restaurants found that it was the latest new thing, which was a good moneymaker, but lawyers have found, or not lawyers, well, those who have proposed the legislation. Lawmakers, let's say that. Thank you. They found that there was reason to at least curtail that because that was a double whammy that they're trying to prevent. People are both drinking and getting high at the same time in one fell swoop.
Although, from a police enforcement aspect, if there's alcohol in your system, it's easier to detect that than the marijuana, so that it might be easier to enforce the driving rules.
And maybe that's a good argument for them too.
Yeah.
An interesting law that's across the books now. New York City residents and other states are now having a new option. You could be M for male, F for female, or X, genderless. So on birth certificates in various states, New York being one, the mother can choose to put X on the books for the sex of the child. Thoughts about that?
When the child's born?
When the child's born.
The child's not deciding this, the mother is deciding.
Birth certificate.
I can see a lot of problems with that for the child. For the father, does the father weigh in on that? Or is it just the mom who decides? And could there be litigation between mom and dad? Do we have a son or daughter or an ex? I can see problems with that. Now, I see less problems if the law says that after the person becomes 18, if they want a petition to change their birth certificate, they might be allowed to do that. I will tell you, many years ago, I had a client who was what do we call that, transgender? Changed gender. Mm-hmm. And I filed a petition to amend the birth certificate, not only to change her name, but also to change her birth certificate to reflect that she was now female. And I filed that petition along with, under seal, the operative reports to show that she went through everything she needed to go through, and the judge granted that petition and changed her birth certificate.
How many years ago was that, David?
Probably 10.
And it was it met with opposition?
Nope.
It went through.
It was a good judge. I did it through probate court, and I had all of the documentation and everything else, and the judge did it. I don't really know how my client made out with Department of Vital Statistics when she went to do that, but she had a court order, so I'm assuming she never came back to me that they honored the court order. Sounds
right. Not surprisingly, the driver's licenses in many states are now being legally adjusted if someone has chosen to do this. So that would say 16, not necessarily 18, but at least then it implies that someone themselves personally had the choice rather than the parent, the birth mother or whatever, making the decision that they are X for now. X marks the spot.
And so interestingly, you raised driver's license. I just recently went to the Registry of Motor Vehicles because in Rhode Island, your driver's license can still be just a regular driver's license or what they call the real ID, which is federally mandated at some point in time to come into place where you won't be able to travel domestically with just a Rhode Island driver's license. You need one that meets the requirements of a federal ID. And it was an interesting process. And so my experience was I got to spend a nice quantity of time at the Department of Motor Vehicles, or the registry, waiting to get brought up to the window. And so that time passed quickly. I read a book on my phone. I could have probably read two. And then you have to bring all sorts of documents. So you need one document that identifies you, and that can be a passport, birth certificate with your current driver's license as long as it's valid, or a couple of other things that they had. If you're a naturalized citizen, I think there's a document you can use for that. And then you need to prove your residence, and so you have to bring
your electric bill,
utility bill, and a tax bill if you have a tax bill, or two items that prove that, and then your Social Security number. And so my mom got my Social Security card when I was like 2. and I don't know exactly where she put it. So you can bring a W-2 or 1099 within the last, I think, 2 years. That shows, that has your name and your social security number on it. And you need 2 of those, I think, to do that, or your social security card.
So that sounds like quite an investment of time, never mind at the place, but even prior to that, to make sure you have all of the documents. Heaven forbid if you ever showed up there and didn't have the
I spent all the time before I went to make sure I had the checklist and I was able to check off. And to be honest with you, I brought extras of everything just in case they didn't like one of them. Okay, well, here's another. How's this one? And so I had a little folder. I went. It was actually very smooth when you go in, you check in, so the person checks to make sure you have everything. That was pretty good. And then when you get to the window, if you have everything, that was pretty well done as well. It's just a little bit of a wait.
So the thought is that that's the way of the world, that's the way they're moving, but it doesn't have to be done right now. It's just in the works,
correct.
So to speak.
And so when I went to check in to do it, the woman said to me, you have a passport, because I use the passport for my ID. You don't really need this. And I said, yeah, I think I'm going to need it at some point in time. So since I have to, my license would expire on my birthday, I have to get a new one anyway. I may as well invest the time and just get it done now.
So as we're speaking about this, yes, there's the issue about the birth certificate being marked X, and eventually, while now there are some driver's licenses that'll have that, what happens, as you bring this up, with the passport, and what happens with your flight information when you book your reservation? It needs to absolutely coincide with whatever they're checking at TSA. If one says X and one says F or whatever, even though your name and the rest is together, seems to me that's going to be slowing down the system.
It'll be an issue, I'm pretty sure. So if your birth certificate doesn't match whatever it is that you're using, that'll be a problem.
In the short amount of time that we have left, opioid crisis, we all hear about how bad it is. Apparently now there is, in at least New York and some other states, giving back leftover prescriptions. The Drug Take Back Act, they're expecting drug manufacturers to be responsible for the leftover costs. Drug collection that seems like it would go a long way to not only cleaning up our water supplies when they're dumping it in trash and wherever else that it goes, but it seems like that may be a good way to have people responsibly get rid of things that they no longer need.
A number of issues with that whole problem, which really is the next big thing, I think, for states to tackle. And so getting the drug companies on board to help clean up, as you say, what's left over, great idea. Use of Narcan in police departments should become more prevalent. And I've heard doctors who are experts in this area speak about training doctors on writing prescriptions and how to be careful with what they're doing in that area.
If they do, there'll be fewer leftovers, hopefully.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Well, we've certainly tackled quite a few new laws. Stay tuned to the Law Matters in the coming months. It matters to you.